In the shadowed recesses of the Sanctum Sanctorum, where dust motes dance in the fractured light of holographic star charts, the question echoes. It is a ghost, a murmur that has haunted the history of the Imperium for 10,000 years. It is a query whispered in the barracks of Astra Militarum troopers, on forgotten worlds debated in the blood-slicked fighting pits of gladiatorial Primarchs, and contemplated in the silent chambers of inquisitorial rosettes. It is a question both simple in its phrasing and impossibly complex in its answer. Who was the strongest? To ask this of the Primarchs, the 20 demigod sons of the Emperor of mankind, is to attempt to measure infinity with a carpenter's rule. It is to seek a single truth in a galaxy defined by multifaceted, brutal, and often contradictory realities. The uninitiated, those whose understanding of power is forged in the simplistic crucible of physical confrontation, might seek the answer in the arena. They would envision a grand tournament, a contest of arms, where brother is pitted against brother, and the last one standing is crowned the victor. But such a view is a disservice to the nature of these beings and the very fabric of the grim darkness they inhabit. Strength in the 41st millennium is a far more elusive and terrifying concept than mere martial prowess. To truly approach an answer, we must first dismantle the question itself. What is strength? Is it the raw, unadulterated fury of Angron, whose rage could shake the foundations of a mountain? Is it the unyielding resilience of Rogel Dawn, who could transform any patch of barren rock into an impregnable fortress? Or is it the subtle, insidious power of Alfarius, whose victories were won in the shadows, a poisoned whisper that toppled empires before a single bolter was fired? The answer, if it exists at all, lies not in a single quality, but in a synthesis of many. It is a chimera, a composite beast, built from the virtues and sins of these legendary figures. Therefore, our quest for understanding must be guided by a more sophisticated framework. We shall not seek a champion of the duel, but a master of the multifaceted art of war and dominion. Our analysis will be filtered through 3 distinct but interconnected lenses, each representing a core tenet of power in this age of strife. First, we shall consider martial prowess. This is the most straightforward of our criteria, the bloody heart of the matter. It is the measure of a Primarch as an individual combatant. Their skill with a blade, their speed, their strength, their raw capacity to kill. Here we will examine their legendary duels, their feats of arms on the battlefield, and the sheer destructive force they could unleash when their fury was kindled. From the savage dance of Leman Russ to the angelic grace of Sanguinius, we will weigh their personal contributions to the symphony of slaughter. This is strength as a scalpel, precise and deadly in the hands of a master. Second, we must analyze their strategic genius. A Primarch was more than a warrior. They were a general, a leader of 100,000 transhuman killers. A duel can decide a single life, but a strategy can decide the fate of a solar system. Here we will delve into the minds of the great commanders. We will scrutinize the logistical brilliance of Robot Guilliman, who saw the galaxy not as a battlefield, but as a spreadsheet of resources and supply lines. We will dissect the unorthodox lightning-fast assaults of Jagatai Khan, who understood that victory often lies in striking where the enemy is not. We will explore the grinding, merciless attrition warfare of Perturabo, who could calculate the precise cost in lives to achieve any objective. This is strength as a hammer shaping the anvil of war itself, directing the flow of history through grand campaigns and meticulous planning. Finally, we will examine the most esoteric and perhaps most potent of our metrics, unique abilities, and warp affinity. These were not men, but creations of arcane science and forbidden arts, touched by the raw power of the Imperium. Their strength transcended the physical. We must consider the terrifying prescience of Conrad Kurz, who saw the future in horrifying flashes of murder and betrayal. We must attempt to comprehend the sheer psychic might of Magnus the Red, who could unmake reality with a thought, a living conduit to the hellish power of the warp. We must acknowledge the perpetual nature of Vulcan, whose ability to resurrect from any wound made him an unkillable avatar of hope and fire. This is strength as a force of nature, an inherent, often terrifying power that defies conventional understanding and bends the rules of reality to their will. Only by examining each Primarch through all three of these lenses can we hope to form a complete picture. To praise a warrior for his dueling skill while ignoring his strategic blunders is to see only a fraction of the truth. To laud a commander for his logistical acumen while forgetting his personal failings in combat is to paint an incomplete portrait. The strongest Primarch was not merely the best fighter, the best general, or the most powerful psyker. The strongest was the one in whom these qualities found their most potent and effective balance, or perhaps the one whose singular, overwhelming talent in one area was so profound that it could overshadow all other considerations. This is not a simple ranking. This is a scholarly autopsy of demigods. We are sifting through the ashes of a dream, examining the broken pillars of a fallen age. The chronicles are fragmented, tainted by bias, and warped by the passage of 10,000 years of unceasing war. But within these data crypts, within the litanies of praise and the confessions of traitors, a hierarchy begins to emerge. It is a dangerous knowledge, for to name one strongest is to name the others wanting. And in the history of the Emperor's sons, the perception of being found wanting was often the catalyst for the most terrible of wars. So let us begin. Let us light the lumen globe, unseal the stasis vaults of history, and dare to ask the question that has cost so much blood to debate. Who among the scattered and the damned was the strongest of them all? In any grand ranking there must be a foundation. There must be those who by comparison define the lower boundaries of power, whose legacies, while significant, do not place them in the pantheon of the supreme combatants. It is here in the shadows of their more martially renowned brethren that we first encounter the outliers, the specialists, the ones whose strength was of a different, more subtle, and in some ways more insidious nature. These are the overlooked, and to dismiss them is to misunderstand the very nature of the war they fought. Our examination begins with the Urizen the Golden Sun, Lorga Aurelian. By the brutal calculus of the Great Crusade, Lorga was often judged a failure. His compliance actions were slow, his methods inefficient. He sought to build monuments of faith rather than mountains of corpses, to convert rather than conquer. Placed in a gladiatorial pit with Angron or Russ, it is almost certain that Lorga's life would have ended swiftly. He did not possess the unchained fury or the savage killer instinct of his brothers. His frame, while that of a demigod, was built for the pulpit, not the abattoir. The emperor himself rebuked him, humiliated him, and in doing so made the gravest of errors. He judged Lorga by the standards of a common warrior, failing to see that the Golden Sun's power was never meant for the physical plane. Lorga's strength was not in his Crozius, but in his word. He was a creature of absolute, unwavering belief, and he possessed the terrible charisma to make entire worlds ideology a force more relentless and enduring than any power maul. Where his brothers conquered worlds, Lorga conquered souls. He was the first to truly comprehend the cosmic powers that lurked beyond the veil of reality, to understand that the gods of the warp offered a truth, however terrible, that was far more compelling than the secular atheism of his father. His pilgrimage into the Eye of Terror was not a flight of weakness, but a quest for a power great enough to humble an emperor. And he found it. The Horus Heresy was born not on the sands of Darwin, but in the pages of the Lectitio Divinitatus, and the dark revelations whispered to a son desperate for a father worthy of his worship. Lorga's strength is proven by its legacy. Every cultist that rises on a hive world, every blasphemous prayer uttered by a traitor marine, every soul fed to the thirsting gods is a testament to the power of the Urizen. He did not win his war with a sword, but with a book. And that in the long dark history of the galaxy has proven to be a far more dangerous weapon. From the power of ideology we turn to the power of deception, to the most enigmatic of all the Primarchs, Alpharius and Omegon, the Hydra. the last. To even speak of their strength in the same context as the others is a category error. One cannot measure the strength of a ghost, nor quantify the power of a lie. The twin Primarchs of the Connexth Legion were masters of a warfare so total and so subtle that its true scope may never be known. Their power did not lie in their ability to meet an enemy head-on. It lay in their ability to ensure that the enemy never knew who they were, where they were, or even if they were fighting the Alpha Legion at all. They were the ultimate saboteurs, spy masters, and agents of misdirection. A victory for Alfarius was not a glorious charge, but a critical piece of infrastructure failing at a decisive moment. It was a trusted advisor revealing himself as an operative at the heart of an enemy command structure. It was a rival force being fed manipulated intelligence that led them into a catastrophic ambush laid by a completely different legion. The strength of the Hydra was the chilling realization that any part of your own operation could in fact be one of its heads. They were a mimetic virus in the data streams of the Great Crusade. While their martial skill was undoubtedly that of a Primarch, and accounts of Alfarius's duel with Rogel Dawn prove he was a formidable combatant to focus on, this is to miss the point entirely. Their true power was exponential. It was the sum of their thousands of agents, their countless sleeper cells, their labyrinthine plots that unfolded over decades. To fight the Alpha Legion was to punch at smoke to find yourself entangled in a web of your own making, and to realize only at the very end that your defeat was sealed long before the first shot was ever fired. They are the ultimate testament to the principle that power is not always visible. It can be a whisper, a secret, a dagger in the dark that fells a giant far more effectively than the mightiest sword. Having established the power of the intangible, we now turn our gaze to the masters of the material, the demigods whose strength was expressed in plasteel ceramite and the unyielding logic of physics. These are the architects of victory and the breakers of empires, the Primarchs who understood that the galaxy was won not merely by the sword, but by the fortress and the forge. Their genius was less flashy than that of a duelist, but it formed the very bedrock of the Great Crusade. First among these is the Lord of Iron Perturabo, the master of the unforgiving art of the siege. To comprehend the power of Perturabo is to comprehend the grim arithmetic of war. He was a master of overwhelming force, a cold and bitter genius who could dissect any fortification with a glance identifying its stress points and calculating the precise amount of ordnance and manpower required to grind it into dust. His strength was not in inspirational charges or heroic duels, but in the relentless, methodical application of overwhelming power. He was the embodiment of attrition, a Primarch who saw battlefields as mathematical problems to be solved with the lives of his own legionaries as a resource to be expended. His tragedy and the source of his immense power was his soul. He was an artificer, a creator shackled to the role of a destroyer. He yearned to build wonders that would rival the Emperor's own, yet he was only ever unleashed to tear down the works of others. This deep, simmering resentment honed his skills to a razor's edge, transforming his campaigns into acts of bitter, punitive perfection. The strength of Perturabo was the power of inevitability. To see the Iron Warriors deployed for a siege was to know that the fortress would fall. There was no question of if only when and at what horrifying cost. He was the hammer of the crusade, and before his cold fury the walls of galaxy-spanning empires were turned to rubble. In perfect opposition to the breaker stands the builder, the unyielding bastion against which all tides must break, Rogel Dawn, the Praetorian of terror. If Perturabo's strength was in dismantling, Dawn's was in enduring. He was the personification of fortitude, a being of such stoic resolve and absolute certainty that his will alone could harden plasteel and sanctify stone. His power was not passive. It was an active, aggressive form of defense. To Dawn, a wall was not merely a barrier, but a statement of intent, a projection of imperial truth that declared, "Here and no further." His genius was not just in architecture, but in logistics and strategic denial. He understood that to hold a position was to control the flow of a war. His crowning achievement, the fortification of the Imperial Palace during the Siege of Terra, is the single greatest testament to his unique form of power. Against the full warp-fueled might of the 9 traitor legions, against demonic hordes and the fury of his fallen brothers, Dawn's walls held. He was the anchor of the Imperium, in its darkest hour, the unmovable object upon which the Horus heresy shattered. His strength was the power of defiance, the absolute refusal to yield. While others were the Emperor's sword or spear, Rogel Dawn was his shield, and it was a shield that saved humanity from utter damnation. Finally, we consider the master craftsmen, the twin pillars of the Forge, whose strength lay in their ability to create and to endure, Vulcan and Ferrus Manus. Vulcan, the Lord of Drakes, possessed a strength unique among his brothers, a power that fundamentally altered any calculation of combat. He was a perpetual. He could not be truly killed. He was burned to ash in the orbital bombardment of Istvan Fev, yet he returned. He was tortured, torn apart, and hunted across the galaxy by his brother Kurz, yet he endured. This is a form of power that transcends mere toughness. It is the strength of a fundamental concept, the embodiment of hope and resilience. An enemy can fight a warrior, but how can they fight a legend that refuses to die? Compounding this was his unparalleled mastery of artifice. Vulcan was not merely a blacksmith. He was a creator who imbued his works with a piece of his own noble spirit. The weapons he forged were not just tools of death, but symbols of the imperial dream. His strength was the power to persist against all odds and to arm mankind with the very finest tools for its own survival. His brother Ferrus Manus the Gorgon represented a different philosophy of the Forge. Where Vulcan's craft was imbued with soul, Ferrus's was a testament to the perfection of the machine. His hands, sheathed in living necrodermis, were the ultimate symbol of his belief that flesh was weak, and that true strength was to be found in unyielding steel. He was a creature of brutal pragmatism and raw physical power, a blacksmith king who led from the front, his every blow like the strike of a foundry hammer. His strength was in his unforgiving standards and his drive for perfection. He pushed his iron hands to replace their weaknesses with the certainty of the machine creating a legion as resilient and ruthless as himself. While his own very human fury would lead to his tragic demise, the power he championed, the synergy of man and machine, the relentless pursuit of logical mechanical strength, created one of the most powerful and technologically advanced fighting forces in the Imperium, a legacy of iron that would long outlive him. From the tangible strength of steel and stone, our inquiry now descends into the shadows. Here power is not measured in megatons of ordnance or the resilience of fortress walls, but in the silence of a footstep, the glint of a hidden blade, and the corrosive potency of fear. The masters of this domain were the stalkers, the hunters, the Primarchs, who understood that a war could be won, not by meeting an army in the field, but by convincing that army it was already dead. They were the living embodiments of terror and the ghosts of retribution. First and most terrible is Conrad Kurz the Night Haunter. To speak of Kurz's strength is to speak of fear itself, sculpted into the form of a demigod. He was not merely a warrior, he was an instrument of psychological annihilation. His genius lay in his profound and monstrous understanding of the mortal psyche. He knew that the threat of violence was often more powerful than violence itself. A compliance action under the Night Lords was not a battle. It was a campaign of systematic terror. Vox channels would be hijacked, broadcasting the screams of captured sentries for hours. The flayed skins of command staff would be hung from city walls. Power would be cut, leaving entire hive cities in suffocating darkness, haunted by whispers and the occasional blood-curdling shriek. Kurz did not defeat armies. He dismantled societies from the inside out, turning populations upon their own leaders in a desperate bid to appease the monster that hunted them from the dark. This terrifying prowess was amplified by his own unique curse, his precognition. Curze saw the future, but not in clear, controllable visions. He was subjected to an unrelenting torrent of horrifying certainties, flashes of murder betrayal, and his own eventual death. This affliction, while driving him to madness and nihilism, made him an unnervingly effective combatant. He could anticipate a foe's every parry and thrust, reacting to attacks before they were even launched. His strength was the horrifying fusion of a master predator's instinct and a prophet's curse. He was not a conqueror who sought to build. He was a judgment that sought only to punish, and the fear he wielded was a weapon of mass destruction in its own right. As a perfect yet opposing reflection in the shadows stands Corvus Corax, the Liberator, the Primarch of the Raven Guard. He too was a master of the unseen, a creature of darkness and stealth, but where Curze used the dark to inflict terror, Corax used it to deliver hope. His strength was not the bludgeon of fear, but the scalpel of liberation. Raised as a slave in the lightless mines of Lycaeus, Corax learned that true power lay not in dominating the masses, but in empowering them to fight for their own freedom. He was the ultimate master of guerrilla warfare, a revolutionary who could dismantle totalitarian regimes with whispered words and surgically precise strikes. His legion, the Raven Guard, became a reflection of his methods, specializing in infiltration, sabotage, and decapitation strikes that could cripple an enemy force with minimal casualties. Corax's personal power in this arena was almost supernatural. He possessed a unique ability, a form of psychic camouflage or mind shroud, that allowed him to simply vanish from an enemy's perception. He did not become invisible in the conventional sense. He became unnoticeable, a ghost slipping through enemy lines past sentries and auto-sensors, his presence simply edited out of the minds of those who might see him. This made him perhaps the most dangerous assassin of all the Primarchs, capable of appearing beside his target without warning, a silent, dark-winged angel of death. While Curze was the monster that haunted the dreams of the corrupt Corax, was the phantom that brought their nightmares to life. His was the strength of the righteous unseen, the sudden quiet blade in the heart of the tyrant, proving that even in the most oppressive darkness, a single shadow could move to set thousands free. To conclude our initial survey, we now turn to the outliers. These are the Primarchs who defy simple categorization, whose methods and philosophies of war were so uniquely their own that they occupy a distinct space within the hierarchy. They were neither purely siege masters, nor shadow stalkers, nor gladiatorial champions. Their strength was born from a singular vision, making them unpredictable, often underestimated, and utterly indispensable. First we feel the rushing wind and hear the joyful war cry of Jagatai Khan, the great Khan, the warhawk of Chagoris. The Khan's power is often overlooked in these debates, for his nature was as fluid and untamable as the open sky. He was not a creature of fortresses or static battle lines. His strength was the strength of the storm, devastating, swift, and utterly free. He was the undisputed master of mobile warfare, a strategic genius who saw battles not as grinding contests of attrition, but as a flowing dance of opportunity. He understood better than any of his brothers that true victory lay in the art of the decisive strike, the perfectly timed charge that shatters an enemy's flank, the feigned retreat that lures a superior force into a killing ground, the lightning redeployment that appears where least expected. His legion, the White Scars, were a reflection of his soul, a horde of laughing killers on steeds of steel and plasma, for whom the thrill of the hunt was as important as the final victory. But to dismiss him as a mere raider is a grave error. Jagatai was a swordsman of breathtaking skill, his speed and ferocity a match for any of his brothers. During the Siege of Terra, while Dawn was the shield and Sanguinius the icon, it was Jagatai Khan who was the tip of the spear. He led the desperate, breakneck counter-assaults that kept the traitors off balance, his jet bike a blur of white and crimson against a tide of damnation. His defense of the Lion's Gate spaceport was a masterclass in dynamic defense, a singular achievement that prevented the encirclement of the palace. The Khan's power was the strength of absolute, untethered freedom. He could not be predicted, he could not be pinned down, and in the heart of the most desperate battle, he found not despair, but joy. Finally, we come to the architect of empire, the master of logistics, and the ultimate statesman of the Primarchs, Robuta Guilliman, the Avenging Sun. It has become common to dismiss Guilliman in matters of pure strength, to label him a bureaucrat or an administrator more suited to a scriptorium than a battlefield. This is perhaps the most profound underestimation in the history of the Imperium. Guilliman's primary strength was his mind, a strategic engine of unparalleled capacity. Where his brothers saw a battle, Guilliman saw the entire war. He possessed a grasp of macro-strategy, logistics, and governance that dwarfed all others. His creation, the realm of Ultramar, stands as a testament to this 500 worlds of stability and prosperity, a shining example of the imperial dream made manifest. This ability to organize, to build, and to maintain is not a passive, non-combat strength. It is the very engine of lasting victory. An army, no matter how skilled, is nothing without supply lines. A conquest is nothing without a stable government to follow. Guilliman's power was the power of civilization itself. In personal combat, he was no specialist, but a supreme pragmatist. He was a master of every weapon, every style, a perfectly balanced warrior who approached a duel with the same cold, analytical logic that he applied to a star chart. He would identify his enemy's weakness and exploit it with ruthless efficiency. His true strength, the strength that allowed him to be resurrected and to take command of a shattered Imperium, is the power of order against chaos. He is the force that rebuilds the mind that plans for the next millennium, not just the next battle. While other Primarchs were storms, walls, or shadows, Guilliman was the foundation upon which an entire galaxy-spanning empire was built, broken, and may one day be built again. His is the slow, inexorable, and enduring strength of civilization itself. We have now moved beyond the strategists, the builders, and the shadows. We have set the stage and defined the terms. Now we step into the blood-soaked arena, the heart of the matter, where demigods clash and galaxies tremble. We enter the domain of the Titans, the Primarchs, whose names are synonymous with martial supremacy, whose very presence on a battlefield was enough to shatter the morale of an army. And in this pantheon of killers, none burned with a purer, more self-destructive fire than the Red Angel, the Lord of the World Eaters, Angron. To understand the strength of Angron is to understand the alchemy of pain. He was not merely born a warrior, he was reforged by agony into a living weapon. Discovered on the brutal world of Nuceria, raised in the gladiatorial pits, he became a champion of the enslaved, a brother to those who fought and died beside him. His tragedy was the Emperor's intervention, a teleportation rescue that Angron saw as the ultimate betrayal, stealing him away from his chosen family in their final defiant battle. He was a king without a kingdom, a savior who had failed to save, and this grief, this fathomless rage became the foundation of his being. But it was the butcher's nails that perfected his torment. These vile archaeotech implants hammered into his skull were not a gift of power, but a curse of eternal suffering. They were a parasitic engine of aggression, rewriting his neural pathways, carving away every sensation except the searing agony that could only be quelled by the red release of slaughter. The nails did not just make him angry, they made anger his only possible state of existence. Thus, Angron's power was unlike that of his brothers. It was not born of discipline training or strategic acumen. It was the raw, explosive energy of a soul in constant, unimaginable torment. On the battlefield, he was not a general. He was a natural disaster. He did not lead his men with tactics. He inspired them to shared insanity, the nail's brutal signal echoing in the war gear of his legion, turning the World Eaters into a berserker horde that knew no fear, no strategy, only the desperate need to kill or die. His physical strength was the stuff of horrific legend, a force that seemed to defy the very laws of physics. It was Angron who, during the Shadow Crusade, was witnessed holding aloft the leg of a warhound titan, a feat of such impossible power that it bordered on the mythological. He did not do this through psychic might or technological aid, but through sheer unadulterated physical force, his muscles bulging and screaming with the effort, fueled by a hatred so profound it could momentarily overpower reality. In single combat, he was a maelstrom of chain axes and unrestrained fury. He possessed none of the elegant swordsmanship of the lion or the tactical grace of Horus. His style was a torrent of unrelenting, brutal offense. To fight Angron was not to engage in a duel, but to attempt to survive an avalanche. He would sustain horrific injuries, shrugging off wounds that would have felled any other Primarch, his transhuman biology, and the maddening agony of the nails simply refusing to let him fall. His legendary confrontation with Leman Russ is a prime example. In what was arguably one of the most savage duels in Primarch history, the two avatars of fury tore at each other with no thought for defense, and the accounts are clear Angron was winning. He overpowered the Wolf King, beating him down through sheer relentless ferocity, and was poised to deliver the killing blow when circumstance and their respective legions intervened. He proved that in a pure contest of raw power and aggression, he was almost without equal. Yet within this incredible strength lay his most profound weakness. Angron was a creature of pure, predictable rage. His fury was his greatest asset and his most crippling liability. He was a blunt instrument in a galaxy that often required a scalpel. He could not be reasoned with, he could not strategize, he could not retreat. His only answer to any problem was a headlong charge. A cunning opponent did not need to match his strength, they only needed to direct it. He could be baited, lured into traps, and his legion could be bled white while their Primarch was engaged in a singular, bloody-minded rampage. The very source of his power, the butcher's nails, prevented him from ever becoming a true commander. He was a peerless gladiator, a champion of the pit, perhaps the strongest of his brothers in a raw, physical sense. But war is more than a duel. His strength was a raging inferno, magnificent and terrifying to behold, but it was a fire without focus, a blaze that consumed all in its path, including ultimately himself and his own sons. He is the ultimate benchmark for raw physical might, but his lack of control, his tragic inability to be anything more than a slave to his own pain keeps him from the highest throne. If Angron represents the purest form of uncontrolled rage, our next subject embodies savagery honed to a purpose. He is the Tempest, the Predator, the living embodiment of the Warrior King archetype. He is Leman Russ, the Wolf King of Fenris, the Emperor's great executioner. To the unprepared eye, Russ might appear to be a mere barbarian, a drunken, boasting brawler whose love for the brawl overshadowed any strategic thought. This perception, however, is a carefully cultivated facade, a hunter's camouflage that concealed one of the most cunning and dangerous minds among the Primarchs. The strength of Leman Russ was the strength of the Alpha Predator. It was not the mindless fury of a berserker, but the calculated, patient, and utterly lethal violence of a wolf on the hunt. He understood the art of war on an instinctual level. He knew when to feast and laugh, putting his enemies off their guard with his boisterous, uncivilized demeanor, and he knew precisely when to strike his mood, turning in an instant from mirth to murderous focus. His campaigns were not the grinding sieges of Dawn or the elegant envelopments of the Khan. They were hunts. The Space Wolves would test their enemy, harry their flanks, draw them out, learn their every weakness before closing in for a final decisive and shockingly brutal kill. Russ was a master of timing and applied force, a tactician who could appear to be a wild berserker while simultaneously maneuvering his legion into the perfect position for a decapitating strike. This calculated barbarism made him a terrifyingly effective weapon, as it combined the raw power of a Primarch, with the cunning of a seasoned predator. It was this unique combination of savagery and shrewdness that led to his most solemn and terrible title, the Emperor's Executioner. When a legion faltered, when a brother needed to be brought to heel, it was Russ who was so often unleashed. This role implies a specific and terrible kind of strength, the ability to reliably defeat his own kind. He was the ultimate sanction, the final brutal answer to a question the Emperor hoped he would never have to ask. The most potent proof of this title was written in the flames of Prospero. When Magnus the Red, in his hubris, shattered the Imperial Webway project, it was Russ who was dispatched to bring him to Terra. And when the mission turned from sanction to extermination, Russ carried out his duty with devastating efficiency. He did not simply throw his legion at Magnus's psychers. He arrived with a force perfectly tailored to his foe. He brought with him the silent horror of the Sisters of Silence, whose very presence was anathema to the warp and the golden might of the Adeptus Custodes. He turned the capital city of Tizca into a slaughterhouse, his wolves' primal fury a perfect grounding counter to the ethereal powers of the Thousand Suns. The final duel between Russ and Magnus is a legend that defines them both. It was a clash of fundamental opposites, the raw, visceral power of the material world against the limitless intellectual might of the Empyrean. Magnus unleashed torrents of psychic energy that could unmake reality, but Russ, a creature of sagas and instinct, weathered the storm. He was a force of grounded, savage truth against the Crimson King's arcane lies. With his frost blade, Mjolnir, and the Emperor's own spear, Russ fought with a fury that was both personal and purposeful. He was not merely fighting a brother, he was culling a rogue element, executing a sentence. The climax of that battle, Russ lifting Magnus high and breaking his back over his knee, is more than an act of violence. It is an act of judgment. It is the physical manifestation of his purpose, the ultimate proof that his specific brand of focused ferocity could bring even the most powerful of his siblings to ruin. This terrible duty reveals the core of Russ's being. He was not simply a monster, he was fiercely loyal, capable of great affection and revelry, yet this loyalty was to his father and the Imperium above all else. He was the Emperor's hound, and his love for his brothers would never stand in the way of his duty. This gave his strength a chilling resolve. It was not the rage of a broken gladiator, but the righteous fury of a king protecting his realm. He was the embodiment of necessary violence, a living Mjolnir forged to shatter those who would betray the imperial dream. He was far more than a barbarian. He was a cunning killer, a master of the hunt, and the final terrible word in any argument his father sought to end. His strength was the strength of purpose, the unshakable conviction of his role as the ultimate executioner. Leaving behind the realms of calculated savagery and brute force, our investigation now ascends to an entirely different plane of existence. We turn to the Primarch, whose power was not of the flesh, but of the mind and soul, a being who wielded the very fabric of reality as his weapon. This is the story of Magnus the Red, the Crimson King, the sorcerer of Prospero. To ask if Magnus was strong is to fundamentally misunderstand the scale of his existence. He was, without exaggeration, a power of a different magnitude, a being whose potential psychic might was second only to the Emperor himself. Magnus's strength was the strength of the cosmos itself. From his single cyclopean eye, he did not see the galaxy as a collection of stars and planets, but as a living, breathing ocean of psychic energy, the immaterium, the great ocean, the warp. While his brothers communicated via astro-telepathy, Magnus could project his astral form across light years, appearing as a shimmering giant in the void, to converse with his sons, or even engage enemy fleets. He was a scholar of the esoteric, a seeker of forbidden truths, and his mastery over the esoteric arts was absolute. He could conjure storms of Empyrean fire to incinerate armies, raise crystalline shields to deflect orbital bombardments, and scry the twisting paths of the future. The great library of Prospero was not merely a collection of books. It was the ultimate testament to his philosophy that knowledge was power and that the warp was the greatest source of knowledge in existence. While his brothers were masters of the art of war, Magnus was a master of reality. His presence on a battlefield was a living violation of physical law, a demonstration that the thoughts of a demigod could be more destructive than 1,000 cannons. His strength was of a different class entirely, a metaphysical weapon in a galaxy of physical conflicts. Yet within this oceanic power lay the seed of his own damnation. Magnus's tragedy was not one of malice, but of hubris. He was an intellectual, a philosopher, and he viewed the warp with the detached curiosity of a scholar, not the cautious terror of a soldier. He believed himself the master of its currents, convinced that he could wield its incredible power without succumbing to the predatory intelligences that swam in its depths. The emperor, who understood the true sentient malevolence of the Imperium, forbade him and his legion from practicing sorcery at the Council of Nicaea, an edict Magnus saw as the stifling of progress, the chaining of a mind that was meant to soar. His pride, his unshakable belief in his own wisdom and control, would lead to a catastrophe that wounded the Imperium more deeply than any single act of betrayal. Upon discovering Horus's treachery through his arts, Magnus, in a desperate and arrogant act, chose to disregard all warnings. He gathered his immense power not to send a message, but to tear a hole in reality itself, projecting his consciousness directly into the imperial palace on Terra. This psychic battering ram born of noble intent shattered the Emperor's most secret and vital project, the Imperial Webway. The psychic shockwave of his arrival breached the Golden Throne Room, opening a gateway for the demonic legions of chaos to pour into the very heart of the Imperium. With a single well-intentioned act, Magnus's power crippled. His father destroyed the dream of a human-controlled webway and unleashed hell on Earth. His strength, the very thing he believed made him supreme, proved to be the most devastating weapon against the cause he sought to serve. This brings us to the question of his physical prowess. It is a mistake to assume Magnus was a mere sorcerer who was helpless without his powers. He was a Primarch. He was a giant of crimson skin and formidable strength, a cyclopean warrior who could wield a blade with the skill of a master. In battle, he was a terrifying synthesis of sorcerer and warrior, his blade a blur of silver, his mind a nexus of destructive energy. However, his ultimate reliance on his psychic abilities proved to be a critical, exploitable weakness. The lesson came at the hands of Leman Russ on the smoking ruins of Prospero. The Wolf King did not meet Magnus on his own terms. He brought a force specifically designed to be his undoing. The null field projected by the Sisters of Silence was a psychic dead zone, a suffocating blanket of silence that choked Magnus's connection to the warp. For the first time, the Crimson King was forced to fight largely as his brothers did, as a being of flesh and blood and steel. In that brutal physical arena against a Primarch whose entire being was honed for the purpose of killing his own kind, Magnus's physical might was found wanting. Russ's savage, grounded ferocity was the perfect antidote to Magnus's ethereal power. The breaking of his back was not just a physical defeat, it was a philosophical one. It was the brutal, bloody triumph of physical reality over arcane theory. Magnus possessed a power that in theory could have made him the strongest of all, but it was a power so dangerous, so unstable, and so tied to the corrupting influence of the warp that it became his undoing. He was a king of infinite space, undone by the grim, finite reality of a wolf's bite. From the ethereal fires of the warp, our focus returns to the cold, hard reality of steel and strategy. We now consider a Primarch who embodies the ideal of the perfect warrior, a demigod of chilling competence, whose mastery of nearly every facet of warfare places him in the highest echelons of this debate. He is the first son, the Primarch of the First Legion, a figure of myth and legend cloaked in the emerald green of his knightly order. He is Lion L. Johnson, the Lion of Caliban. To analyze the Lion is to analyze the concept of martial perfection. He was not a specialist in the same vein as some of his brothers. He was a supreme generalist, a being whose baseline of excellence in all martial disciplines was so high that he could meet and exceed the specialists in their own fields. The Lion's strength was twofold: a perfect synthesis of strategic genius and personal combat prowess that few, if any, could match. As a strategist, his mind was a cold, logical engine of war, considered by the histories to be the equal of even Horus and Gilliman. His approach, however, was distinct. It was not Gilliman's logistical mastery, nor Horus's charismatic diplomacy. The Lion's genius was one of ruthless efficiency and absolute secrecy. He prosecuted his campaigns with a chilling precision, moving the vast and complex formations of his Dark Angels Legion like pieces on a regicide board, each move calculated for maximum impact. He was a master of the set-piece battle of deploying specialized wings, like the Raven Wing and Death Wing, to achieve tactical objectives that would shatter an enemy's command structure and morale long before the main battle lines met. His mind saw the grand canvas of a galactic war, and he painted it with strokes of unforgiving, methodical warfare. In parallel to this strategic acumen was his terrifying skill as a duelist. Raised not among civilized society, but in the monster-haunted neo-feudal wilderness of Caliban, the Lion's childhood was a solitary, unending battle for survival. He was a feral child who grew into a knight, but the wild predator never truly left his heart. This upbringing forged him into arguably the most technically proficient and dangerous fighter of all the Primarchs. His style was not flashy or brutal, it was economical, precise, and utterly lethal. Every parry was a perfectly timed deflection, every thrust was aimed at a killing blow. There was no wasted energy, no boasting, only the pure, cold science of dismantling an opponent. This chilling efficiency was a direct reflection of his soul. The Lion's heart was a fortress, his thoughts and emotions locked away behind layers of paranoia and secrecy. He was distant, aloof, and found it nearly impossible to trust even his own brothers. This emotional coldness, while a social and political weakness, was a source of immense strength in the crucible of war. His decisions were never clouded by sentiment, mercy, or doubt. He did what was tactically and strategically necessary, no matter the moral cost. When he deemed an allied human civilization untrustworthy after a campaign, he ordered their extermination without a moment's hesitation, a pragmatic and brutal act that defined his character. This made him a commander of terrifying effectiveness, but it also sowed seeds of distrust throughout the Imperium. He was a being to be feared and respected, but never truly known or loved. His power was the strength of pure, untempered logic applied to the bloody calculus of total war. His legend is cemented by the quality of the foes he faced and defeated in single combat. His confrontations are the stuff of sagas. The most famous is his duel with Leman Russ. What began as a contest of honor between two of the Imperium's greatest warriors devolved into a brutal year-long battle that culminated in a bare-knuckle brawl. In the final moments of that fight, it was the Lion who landed the decisive blow, a clean strike that knocked the Wolf King unconscious. Though Russ's pride turned the aftermath into a bitter feud, the physical victory was undeniably the Lion's, a clear demonstration that he could best another top-tier combatant in a pure contest of arms. Furthermore, his relentless hunt for his fallen brother Conrad Kurz showcased his superiority over another fearsome duelist. He matched the Night Haunter's terror tactics with cold persistence, and when they finally clashed blade to blade, the Lion's disciplined skill overcame Kurz's precognitive madness, wounding him gravely and proving that pure martial science could defeat even a foe who could see the future. His final and most defining battle of the era was against his own mentor and father figure Luther, who had been empowered by the full might of the Chaos Gods to become a demon prince of terrifying power. On the ruins of their home world, the lion faced down this ultimate betrayal. The battle was apocalyptic, a clash that was as much a struggle of will as it was of swords. And the lion, through his sheer skill and indomitable spirit, emerged victorious, casting down the demon, though he himself was mortally wounded in the process. He proved he could defeat even the most powerful of foes, a true demon prince, paying the ultimate price for his victory. In Lionel Johnson we find the complete warrior, a Primarch who was both a peerless general and a peerless duelist. He is the embodiment of martial perfection, a chilling, effective, and undeniable contender for the title of the strongest. Our journey through the pantheon of demigods now leads us to the sun at the center of the galaxy, the brightest star whose fall into darkness created the black hole that has consumed the Imperium for 10 millennia. We must now analyze the Primarch, who was by his father's own design the epitome of them all. He was the first found the favored son, the Lord of the Lunar Wolves, and the only one to ever hold the title of War Master of the Imperium. He is Horus Lupercal. To assess Horus is to assess two different beings, the demigod he was and the monster he became. In the golden age of the Great Crusade, before the taint of chaos, Horus was without peer. He was the perfect synthesis of his brother's greatest strengths. He possessed a strategic mind to rival Guilliman or the lion, the martial prowess of a champion, and a charismatic soul that none could equal. This was his unique defining strength, his ability to lead. Where the lion inspired fear and Guilliman commanded respect, Horus inspired genuine love. He understood the hearts of his brothers, he could mediate their rivalries, and he could unify their disparate legions into a single, unstoppable force. His appointment as War Master was not a matter of favoritism, it was a simple recognition of fact. He was the only one capable of shouldering the burden. His genius on the battlefield was marked by its supreme adaptability. He could be as brutally direct as Angron, as swift as the Khan, or as cunning as Alfarius, selecting the perfect doctrine for any engagement. As a warrior, he was sublime. Armed with the great power maul Worldbreaker and the lightning claw known as the Talon of Horus, he was a whirlwind of controlled, intelligent violence. He was not the strongest, nor the fastest, but he was arguably the most complete combatant, a master of timing technique and tactics who had learned at the feet of the Emperor himself. Pre-heresy Horus was the apex of the Primarch project, the living embodiment of the imperial dream. Then came the wound, the fever, and the whispers in the dark. On the moon of Davin, Horus was struck down by a blade, poisoned with the essence of the warp. In his moment of weakness, he was delivered into the hands of chaos worshippers. What followed was not a healing, but a damnation. The chaos gods, seeing in him the perfect vessel for their ambitions, did not merely save his life. They tore open his soul and poured into it all the poison of the galaxy. They fed his pride, twisted his love for his father into bitter jealousy, and showed him visions of a future where he was the forgotten, discarded tool of a tyrannical god. The Horus that emerged from the Serpent Lodge was changed. The brightest star had begun to dim, and in its place a dark fire was kindled. This new power was amplified exponentially after his pilgrimage to the gateway on Molech. There, in a pact with the dark gods, he stepped into the Imperium and was imbued with a measure of the power they themselves had stolen from the Emperor. The being who commanded the Siege of Terra was no longer merely a Primarch. He was a true vessel of chaos, a conduit for the combined might of the four ruinous powers. His strength was no longer just his own. It was the power to command demons to weave sorcery that could shatter reality and to bend the laws of physics to his malevolent will. The final terrible proof of this ascended power came in the war's closing moments aboard the bridge of his flagship, the Vengeful Spirit. The chamber was no longer a command deck, but a temple to chaos, a wound in reality where the impossible was made manifest. It was here that he demonstrated the horrifying extent of his borrowed might. He faced Sanguinius, the great angel, a being of immense power and purity, and he slew him. He broke the angel's body and soul, an act that single-handedly proves the new, terrifying heights his power had reached. Then came the Emperor. In that final cataclysmic confrontation, Horus, suffused with the power of the four gods, was able to do the unthinkable. He struck down the master of mankind, the father who had created him, inflicting wounds so grievous that they would lead to his 10,000-year entombment upon the golden throne. At that moment, Horus Lupercal wielded more raw power than any Primarch had ever conceived of. He had reached a pinnacle of dark glory, capable of defeating beings who were by all rights his absolute superiors. But this power was a lie. It was a monstrous gift with an infinite cost. He was a puppet king, his strings pulled by thirsting gods who gloried in his patricidal rage. The strength he used to strike down his father and brother was not his own. It was the strength of the abyss. For this reason, Horus occupies a paradoxical place. Before his fall, he may have been the best Primarch, the most complete and capable leader. After his ascension, he was undoubtedly the most powerful in terms of raw destructive capability. But can he be called the strongest? His will was not his own, his power was borrowed, and his victory was an illusion that cost him his very soul. He was the fallen Warmaster, a vessel for a power far greater than himself, and in his final moments of clarity, as the Emperor's psychic fire scoured his soul from existence, he was freed from the terrible burden of that power. We have arrived at the final act. We have weighed the souls of strategists, artisans, monsters, and kings. We have witnessed the tragedy of the Warmaster's fall and measured the terrible power gifted to him by the ruinous powers. Now we must turn to the one figure who stands apart. Not merely a warrior or a general, but an icon, a symbol of a hope so pure and bright that its memory still illuminates the darkest corners of the 41st millennium. We now speak of the demigod, who in the hearts of the Imperium has always held the title of the greatest. We speak of Sanguinius, the great angel Primarch of the Blood Angels. To behold Sanguinius was to behold perfection made manifest. He was described as the most beautiful of all the Primarchs, his noble features framed by flowing white hair and crowned by a pair of magnificent snow-white angelic wings. His charisma was a palpable force, a warmth and nobility that exceeded even that of the great Horus. Where Horus commanded loyalty, Sanguinius inspired adoration. His very presence could soothe the rage of his most troubled sons and bring hardened veterans to their knees in awe. Yet this radiant perfection concealed a terrible secret agony. Sanguinius and his legion carried a dual curse, a flaw in their very gene seed that haunted their every moment. The first was the red thirst, a deep-seated craving for blood that threatened to turn his noble sons into ravening beasts. The second, born from the psychic trauma of his own eventual death, was the Black Rage, a madness that would plunge a space marine into a final bloody reenactment of his Primarch's last moments. The true strength of Sanguinius, therefore, was not his effortless grace or his angelic beauty. It was his indomitable will. He was a being of sublime perfection, perpetually at war with a monstrous darkness that festered in his own soul. Every day was a battle, every victory a testament to his mastery over the beast within. This eternal struggle forged in him a strength of character, an empathy and resolve that none of his more stable brothers could ever truly comprehend. This inner strength was reflected in his deeds, which are perhaps the most legendary feats of arms attributed to any single Primarch. The Siege of Terra was his crucible and his monument. As the traitor legions swarmed the imperial palace, it was Sanguinius who became the linchpin of the entire defense. His most iconic moment came at the Eternity Gate, the final doorway into the Emperor's personal sanctum. As a gargantuan host of the damned, a literal ocean of demons surged forth to overwhelm the final line of defense, Sanguinius stood alone. He became a fortress of one, a solitary angel against an infinite tide of chaos. For hours he held that gate, his twin blades a blur of silver and gold, his wings a shield of white against the encroaching darkness. It was a feat of endurance, skill, and sheer power that defies belief, a singular stand that saved the throne world from being overrun. This was not his only legendary confrontation. Twice he faced Kabanda, a bloodthirster of Khorne, one of the most powerful and warlike greater demons in existence, and twice he was victorious. At the Battle of Cygnus Prime, the demon broke the angel's legs and gloated over his seemingly broken form, only for Sanguinius to rise up through sheer will, seize the daemon, and shatter its physical form. Years later at the Eternity Gate, the same demon returned to mock him. Sanguinius, weary from his endless battle, met the bloodthirster again. This time, there was no contest. The angel unleashed the full measure of his righteous fury, not only defeating the demon, but hoisting it high and breaking its back over his knee, an act of utter domination over a being of godlike power. Furthermore, during that same siege, he faced his own fallen brother, Angron, who had by then ascended to the terrible might of a demon prince of Khorne. In a clash of red angels, one divine and one damned Sanguinius cast his maddened brother down, proving his superiority over even a chaos-empowered Primarch in direct combat. Compounding this physical and spiritual might was his own psychic gift, the power of foresight. Like Kurz, Sanguinius was a prophet, but where Kurz was driven mad by visions of murder, Sanguinius carried his knowledge as a sorrowful burden. He saw the future with a tragic clarity, and most clearly of all, he saw the certainty of his own death. He knew, long before he boarded the vengeful spirit, that to face Horus was to die. And in this knowledge we find the ultimate expression of his strength. It was not the strength of a warrior seeking victory, but the strength of a son choosing to sacrifice himself for his father. He walked into the lion's den, not with the hope of winning, but with the certainty of his own demise, choosing to face his fate, to buy humanity one final desperate chance. This is a power that transcends martial skill or psychic might. It is the strength of character, of will, of love, a force more potent than any weapon in the grim darkness of the far future. This sacrifice is the cornerstone of the most enduring legend of the Horus heresy. It is the theory of the chink in the armor. In those final, agonizing moments in Horus's throne room, as the Warmaster, bloated with the power of 4 gods, tore him apart, Sanguinius was not merely a victim. It is believed that with his final breath, with the last ounce of his strength, he found a flaw in his brother's defenses. Whether it was a physical crack made in Horus's Terminator armor, or a psychic wound torn in his chaotic aura, Sanguinius created an opening. It was a weakness, however small, that did not exist before. And it was this weakness, this single flaw, created by the angel's sacrifice, that the Emperor was later able to exploit to finally and utterly destroy the arch-traitor. If this is true, then Sanguinius's death was not a defeat. It was the single most decisive act of the entire war. His final breath was a blow that saved the galaxy. His strength was the power to find victory in absolute sacrifice, a feat of such magnitude that it solidifies his claim, not just to being the strongest, but to being the greatest of them all. Having established the towering legend of Sanguinius through his deeds and sacrifice, let us now place him in the theoretical crucible of combat against the other primary contenders for the title of strongest. It is in these imagined clashes of demigods that the unique and overwhelming nature of his power becomes undeniably clear. This is not merely speculation. It is a tactical analysis based on the known abilities and established feats of these legendary beings. Our first contest is one of pure sublime skill, Sanguinius versus Lion L. Johnson. This would be a duel for the ages, a battle between 2 of the most technically gifted swordsmen the galaxy has ever known. The Lion, the cold and calculating master of blade, work a living embodiment of the science of killing against the Angel, whose every movement was a work of art, a warrior of instinct and grace. In a straight contest on solid ground, the lion's record and ruthless precision would make him a terrifying opponent. He is perhaps the more disciplined and logical fighter. However, Sanguinius possesses two advantages that fundamentally change the equation. The first and most obvious is flight. The angel's wings were not merely decorative. They were a tactical weapon of immense value, granting him total mastery of the third dimension. He could dictate the range of engagement at will, launching attacks from impossible angles, evading and repositioning with a speed that no ground-based warrior could hope to match. The lion's perfect defense means little if the killing blow comes from above. The second, more terrifying advantage is the suppressed fury within him. While the lion's strength comes from cold logic, Sanguinius's power is fueled by a constant, passionate struggle against his inner darkness. If pushed to the brink, if truly desperate, the righteous fury of the angel, a controlled echo of the black rage, would lend his attacks a ferocity and strength that could overwhelm even the lion's peerless technique. The duel would be legendary, but the angel's mobility and hidden well of power would grant him the ultimate edge. Next, we pit him against the Emperor's executioner Sanguinius versus Leman Russ. This is a clash of opposing philosophies, the savage grounded ferocity of the Wolf King against the ethereal deadly grace of the angel. Russ's entire methodology was built around closing with his enemy, enduring their attacks, and tearing them apart in a maelstrom of tooth and claw. He was the ultimate brawler, a Primarch slayer with the durability and relentless aggression to bring down any foe. Against Sanguinius, however, this strategy becomes profoundly difficult. The angel's ability to fly is a near-perfect counter to the wolf's strengths. Russ is a hunter, but his prey can soar far out of his reach. He could not pin Sanguinius down, nor force him into the kind of brutal close-quarters brawl where he excelled. Sanguinius could harry the Wolf King from the air, a blur of white and gold, striking with his spear and blade before soaring away. While Russ's endurance is legendary, he could be worn down, bled by 1,000 cuts from an enemy he could not effectively retaliate against. The wolf's howl of frustration would be his undoing, as the angel's superior mobility would allow him to control the entire tempo of the battle and ultimately claim victory. Finally, we come to a confrontation that is not theoretical, but a matter of historical record, and perhaps the single most compelling piece of evidence in this entire debate, Sanguinius versus the demon prince Angron. During the height of the Siege of Terror, as the battle raged upon the Imperial Palace's walls, Sanguinius faced his fallen brother. This was not the broken gladiator from the Great Crusade. This was Angron, ascended, a creature remade by the blood god Khorne into a true demon prince, a being of monumental physical strength and seething warp energy. He was rage and slaughter given form, a monster who had shed the last vestiges of his humanity. This was Angron at his absolute zenith of power, and Sanguinius defeated him. In a battle witnessed by loyalists and traitors alike, the great angel met the demon king's fury with his own righteous fire and cast him down, breaking his charge and his spirit. The significance of this victory cannot be overstated. Sanguinius, in his own unaugmented state, proved himself the superior of a chaos-empowered Primarch, who was already one of the most physically formidable beings in existence. Herein lies the truth of the angel's power. He was not a specialist. He was the master of all things. He possessed the swordsmanship to rival the lion, the righteous fury to match Russ, the psychic foresight of a prophet, and a unique tactical advantage in his wings that no other could claim. His strength was a perfect synthesis, the skill of a duelist, the speed of an angel, the will of a martyr, and the hidden terrible power of a berserker held in perfect, noble check. It was this combination of abilities forged in the crucible of his own inner torment that made him the most potent and complete warrior of all his legendary brothers. The archives grow silent. The data scrolls have been read, the chronicles examined, and the legends compared. We have sifted through the ashes of betrayal and glory weighed the power of the fist, the mind, and the soul. Now a verdict must be rendered. After all the analysis, after all the debate, one figure stands above the rest, his wings casting a shadow of undeniable supremacy over all his brothers. The title of the strongest Primarch in its truest and most complete sense belongs to Sanguinius of the Blood Angels. This conclusion is not reached lightly. We must acknowledge the other titans who laid claim to this throne. Was Horus empowered by the 4 gods of chaos, more powerful at the height of the siege? Yes. He was a vessel of cosmic malice, a dark god in mortal form, who struck down an angel and the Emperor himself. But that power was not his own. It was a borrowed parasitic strength, a gift from the abyss that came at the cost of his soul. To name him the strongest would be to name his dark masters the victors. Similarly, did Magnus the Red possess the greatest raw potential? Arguably, yes. His psychic might was a force that could unmake reality. But his power was a raging, unstable fire, a double-edged sword of immense power and inherent vulnerability. His hubris turned his gift into a curse that did irreparable harm to the Imperium. His strength was untempered by wisdom and was thus fatally flawed. Sanguinius stands apart because his strength was wholly his own. He represents the apex of what a Primarch could be, the perfect realization of the Emperor's design. He was not a vessel for external powers, nor a slave to a flawed and dangerous gift. His was the strength of a demigod in perfect, albeit tragic, balance. But his claim to the title is cemented not merely by the foes he defeated, but by the burdens he shouldered. His legacy is one of sacrifice. The true measure of his power was not in his ability to kill, but in his capacity to endure. He was strong enough to master the genetic curse that afflicted his very being, to live every day with a monster clawing at the inside of his soul and emerge as a paragon of nobility. He was strong enough to bear the terrible knowledge of his own certain death and yet walk toward it with his head held high, not in despair, but with purpose. His greatest strength was revealed in his final choice. He chose sacrifice over survival, hope over despair. He gave his life not in a vain attempt to win, but to provide the single desperate chance that humanity needed to endure. This moral fortitude, this strength of character is a power far greater and more meaningful than the ability to shatter mountains or conquer worlds. Sanguinius was the strongest because he carried the greatest weight, faced the darkest fate, and in doing so became the eternal symbol of the very best that humanity was ever meant to be. And so the chronos tick to a halt. The last data slate is sealed, and the dust settles once more in this quiet archive of 1,000,000 tragedies. We have reached a verdict. We have named the strongest. But as the echoes of this debate fade into the long silence, a final chilling thought emerges. Perhaps in the end, the answer was never as important as the question itself. This entire exercise, this scholarly attempt to rank these demigods, to weigh their souls on the scales of martial virtue and strategic genius, has been an effort to impose logic upon a galaxy defined by madness. It is an attempt to find meaning in a history that has none to seek a victor in a war where every participant in their own way ultimately lost. We began this journey by defining strength in its many forms, and in each Primarch we saw a different facet of its terrible nature. We saw the strength of ideology in Lorgar, a power that could corrupt a galaxy more thoroughly than any fleet. We saw the strength of deception in Alpharius, a power that rendered armies and fortifications meaningless. We witnessed the unyielding strength of the fortress in Dawn, and the furious strength of the forge in Perturabo. We felt the chilling strength of fear in the hands of Conrad Kurz, and the inexorable strength of civilization in the mind of Robuta Gilliman. We were scorched by the raw, agonizing strength of Angren's rage, and humbled by the focused, purposeful strength of Russ's savagery. We touched the infinite, terrible strength of the warp through Magnus, and we saw the cold, perfect strength of the master warrior in Lionel Johnson. And above them all we placed Sanguinius. He was the strongest, a perfect synthesis of grace, power, and will. Yet what is his legacy? It is a legacy of a beautiful, noble death. His greatest feat was not a victory, but a sacrifice. He saved the Imperium not by living, but by dying. His memory is a ghost of a hope that has long since curdled a reminder of a standard that can never again be reached. The strongest of them all is a corpse, his sons doomed to forever chase the phantom of his final agonizing moments. Consider the fates of the others who vied for this title. Horus reached the zenith of power, a height no other Primarch ever attained. He held the throat of the galaxy in his talon, and for a brief, terrible moment he was the master of all. The price for this power was his soul. He died a slave, his consciousness obliterated his name, now a curse whispered across the millennia. His strength brought him only eternal damnation. The lion lives returned from his long slumber. But he does not return to a triumphant brotherhood. He returns to a galaxy in ruins, a stranger in his own legion, haunted by the ghosts of his failures and the betrayal that shattered his home. His strength has brought him not peace, but a lonely, endless hunt in the shadows of a dying age. And Guilliman, the great architect, he too returned. He was gifted the chance to rebuild, only to find the Imperium he once knew replaced by a decaying, superstitious, tyrannical regime, a grotesque mockery of the imperial truth he fought to build. His strength is now the eternal toil of a custodian, desperately patching the cracks in a foundation that is moments from total collapse. What of the others? The demon Primarchs, Angron, Magnus Mortarion, Fulgrim Perturabo? They achieved immortality. Their strength allowed them to transcend the bonds of flesh, only to become eternal prisoners, monstrous puppets of the very gods they once sought to master. They are living testaments to the fact that in the quest for power, the greatest price one can pay is to actually achieve it. This is the ultimate truth of the 41st millennium. This is the lesson etched into the history of these 20 tragic suns. Strength in this galaxy is not a virtue. It is a curse. It is a magnet for the horrors of the warp, a catalyst for pride, and a path to inevitable sorrow. They were the strongest beings of their era, demigods walking among men, and every single one of them was broken upon the anvil of a cruel and unforgiving reality. Their story is not a saga of heroes, but the greatest tragedy of the human race. In the grim darkness of the far future, there are no true victories. There are no happy endings. There is only the endless grinding attrition of a war that can never be won. There is only the memory of a dream that died, and the echoes of the demigods who broke the galaxy and themselves in its name. There is only war and the thirsting laughter of the gods.